It's really easy these days to find inspiration for DIY projects. All you have to do is look online or watch DIY shows on TV. Inspiration is all around us. What's hard to find though is the information you need to actually build those projects successfully. Today though, we're going to show you that building DIY projects isn't nearly as hard as you might think. Once you know some basic techniques, you can apply them over and over again to build all kinds of awesome projects. Take this project for example. It might look complex, but it really isn't. We'll show you the basic assemblies that this project is made from, along with the tools and techniques you can use to create them. Once you know those, you'll be able to apply them over and over again to build awesome projects of all kinds, like these. When you're learning how to build, it always helps to have an example, so we're demonstrating with this project. It's a classic called a step-back cupboard. It has a lower section and an upper one that's slightly smaller or stepped back. To see how it's put together, you can look at the upper section, which is really just a big plywood box that's built a lot like a bookcase. Plywood makes up the sides and the top. Inside it has two adjustable shelves and a thin plywood back that closes it in. There's also a solid wood face frame on the front, and that does two things. First, it covers all these plies in the plywood, which really don't look good on a finished project. Second, it helps strengthen the assembly by preventing that plywood box from twisting or racking. The lower section has a few more parts, but it's still basically a big box that's made out of plywood for the top, sides, and bottom. It also has a solid wood face frame. The difference here is that that face frame also creates openings for the doors and the drawer. To dress up the lower case, it has trim, cap molding that wraps around at the top and down below, molding that's made from ordinary 1x4 boards and a piece of cove molding. The best thing about this project is you can build the entire thing from materials available at any home center. Plywood, boards, and off-the-shelf molding. Plywood is a great material for building projects like the step-back cupboard we're creating, or for things like chests, bookcases, and dressers that are essentially big boxes. Instead of having to put a bunch of narrow boards together, you can break a plywood sheet down into the large panels that are perfect for these box-style projects. Now, a full-size sheet of plywood is big and heavy, but cutting it doesn't have to be a challenge. A great trick is to make a support system like this. It's just 2x4s that are in this case suspended between a Kreg track horse and a Kreg mobile project center. The 2x4s build a strong support, and it also holds the sheet at a height that's very comfortable, so I can cut without having to bend over or be awkwardly working my way around the sheet. Plus, the support helps hold the plywood in position as I'm cutting, and it'll keep the pieces that I cut off from dropping. So it's a really great way to make cutting plywood a whole lot easier. A circular saw is the tool of choice for cutting plywood. But before you grab your saw and start cutting, here's a good idea. Circular saws come with a blade that's made for making fast cuts in framing lumber. Take that blade out and replace it with a blade that's made for cutting plywood. It has more teeth that are also smaller, so it'll take a smaller bite and make a smoother, cleaner cut. Once you have a blade installed, there's one more thing you need to do, and that's adjust your saw for the correct depth of cut. Now, a circular saw will cut all the way through a 2x4, but we don't need it to cut that deep for this 3/4 inch plywood. So, of course, make sure your saw is unplugged before you make any setup changes, and then check the cutting depth. Every saw is a little bit different to adjust, but in the long run, you want to end up with the blade depth, so it's just about 1/8 of an inch below the thickness of your plywood. That way, you'll get a nice clean cut, the saw won't have to work any harder than it needs to, and you won't cut too far into your support grid. So with those things done, you're ready to cut. Supporting your plywood sheet well and setting up your saw correctly will help you cut more safely and more easily, but it won't necessarily help you cut straight. Usually when you're cutting plywood, you draw a long layout line and then try to guide the saw along and eyeball that line, so you're trying to keep the saw straight and keep the cut smooth and make sure you're accurate all at once, and that's just too many things to think about. The solution is to use a saw guide, and there's a couple types available. This one attaches to the saw, and you can adjust the setting, and then the edge guide follows along the edge of the sheet. This one uses a long guide rail that you can place wherever you need it on the sheet, and then the saw rides right on top to make a nice straight cut. With either of these types of guides, you'll get a much better result, a smoother, cleaner cut, and you don't have to worry about trying to keep the saw straight. With the rip cut, you can lock in the measurement that you want. Then hold the edge guide against the edge of the sheet. Push the saw along with one hand while you hold the edge guide with your other hand. That'll guide the saw for a nice straight cut. With the AccuCut, first make a couple of marks where you want to cut. Then align the edge of the anti-chip strip with your marks. As you cut, the anti-slip surface keeps the AccuCut guide rail from moving, and the chip strips produce a smooth, clean cut. When you're building DIY projects, one of the biggest challenges can be coming up with a way to hold everything together to create assemblies that are strong and will last. A lot of people think you need advanced woodworking skills to create a strong assembly, but you really don't. There's a simple way called pocket hole joinery. Pocket hole joinery is done with just a drill and a Kreg jig. The jig guides a special stepped drill bit that creates an angled hole called a pocket hole. You drill a pocket hole in just one of the two pieces that you want to put together, and then drive in a pocket hole screw to create a strong, lasting joint. After you drill the pocket hole, all you have to do is bring the one piece into position against the one you're going to join it to, and then drive in a pocket hole screw, and it's just that easy to attach the two pieces together. So this is the bottom for our step back cupboard and the sides, so we'll drill some holes along this edge, and a few more along the front for that face frame we're going to add later, and we'll be almost ready to start project assembly. So once you drill the pocket holes, in this case in the bottom panel, you can really see the project start to take shape. Because here you'll have the bottom, bring in both sides, and then all you have to do is drive pocket hole screws in to attach these pieces together, and you can see how easily a box really starts to take shape. When you're building DIY projects, adding a few high-end details can really make them stand out. And creating those details is easier than you might think. If you look at the step back cupboard, you'll see that it has feet at the bottom. They add a nice high-end look, plus they help the project sit more stably on any kind of floor. And adding them's really pretty easy. It starts with creating a notch in each of those lower side panels. And that's really easy to do using a tool like the multi-mark. Start by just laying out each end of the notch. All you got to do is use your tape measure and make a quick mark. Because now you can use the square feature of the multi-mark to draw a nice straight line at each of those points. Then, with the rule adjusted to the depth of the notch, you can use it to drag your pencil along and create a perfectly straight line that lays out the notch. Once you have it laid out, it's an easy matter of just cutting the notch with a jigsaw. Start by cutting in along one end line. Then cut in along the other end. Now to cut the long line in between, start by making a sweeping cut until you get to the line, and then cut to one end. Turn the saw around and cut to the other end to complete the notch. In this case, the notch will get covered by trim later, so the cut doesn't even have to be perfect. When you're building with Kreg joinery, assembly is a really easy process, but there are some tips that'll help you have better success. First is to make some layout marks on your pieces. That way you won't have to hold pieces in place and measure at the same time. It's great for areas like where the bottom meets the side panels. The multi-mark's really handy for this because you can just set the distance that you need and then use it to make your marks. Just hold the multi-mark in place and use the rule to guide your pencil. With the marks there, I'll know exactly where to place the bottom panel. Another great assembly tip is to use some clamps while you're putting things together. That way, you don't have to try to hold two pieces in place and keep them aligned while you drive in the screws. Clamps like these work great for holding large panels at perfect 90-degree angles, leaving both of your hands free to drive in the screws. So with the screws in place, you can see the box really start to come together and how easy it is to create a rock-solid assembly. To complete the lower section of the step-back cupboard, all that's left to do is install the top. Just make sure everything's aligned before you drive in those screws. And with Kreg joinery, you can get the pieces positioned drive in a couple of screws, and then move things around as needed until you have it exactly where you want it. And now you can see the project's really starting to take shape. We've got the sides, the bottom, and the top in place with the overhang that we need to add a face frame later. And everything's really solid. When you're building projects with shelves like we have in this step-back cupboard, you can make them a whole lot more functional by making the shelves adjustable. That way you can move the shelves up or down so that you can keep things that are tall or short or in between in your cabinet without having to worry about how they're going to fit. Just move the shelves to where you need them and you're good to go. When you're creating adjustable shelves, you need to drill a series of holes for small pins that the shelves sit on. By moving the pin from hole to hole, that's how you adjust them. Now those holes need to be spaced evenly and consistently at each of the 4 locations so that your shelf will sit flat and it won't wobble. That could be a challenge to do with just a hand drill. But with a shelf pin jig, it makes it easy because the jig has a series of holes at consistent spacing so you can get the holes exactly where you need them. A great tip when you're using a shelf pin jig is to create a spacer. I cut this one to length to match where I want to locate the jig in the cabinet. Just set the spacer in place in the cabinet. And then you can set the jig right on top. Now I know it's located at the height where I want it, and the jig has this fence that hugs up against the edge of the cabinet, so every time I move the jig, I know that it will be at the exact same height. With that set, I'm ready to drill holes. After you drill the first hole, you can insert this locating pin that drops right into the hole. Then you don't even need the spacer to hold the jig in place, and you can drill the rest of your holes. You can see that every time I drill, this stop collar stops the hole at the correct depth. And the result is nice shelf pin holes, a little sanding, they'll be set to go. Now, I can take the spacer and move it to the next location and drop the jig in place. That way I know that these holes and these holes will all be aligned. Drop in the locating pin once again and just keep on drilling. Now, all I'll have to do is a little bit of sanding, and I'll have shelf pin holes. They'll give me perfect shelves that are easy to adjust and that sit level without wobbling. Plywood is a great material for building shelves. It's strong, flat, and a lot more stable than solid wood. Plus, it's a lot easier to make into big panels like this. Plywood does have the plies that show on the edge, though, and you can give your project a great rich look by covering that edge with solid wood edging. It's just cut from a piece of 1x2 and goes right on the front. It looks great and actually makes the shelf stronger. All you have to do to add it is drill some pocket holes in the underside of the shelf. Another great thing about building with pocket hole joinery is you don't have to be real particular about the spacing, especially since you only have to drill holes in one piece. But it's a good idea to have your first pocket hole within an inch or two from the ends, and then every 6 inches or so in between. With the pocket holes drilled, you can attach the edging. And a great way to keep everything in place while you work is to clamp the edging down on a flat surface. Then just butt the shelf up against the edging, and the clamp will hold the edging in place while you drive in the screws. It's just that easy to attach the edging, and it looks really great. And you can see that it definitely finishes off the look of your shelf. When you're building projects from plywood like this one, you usually don't want those exposed plywood edges to show. This project's essentially a big box, but you can transform it and give it a high-end look by adding a face frame. A face frame not only covers the edges, it strengthens the assembly by keeping the box from twisting or racking. A face frame's made from solid wood, in this case 1x3 and 1x2 boards, and just has a few simple parts. There are vertical stiles that get located at the edges and rails that span in between. In this case, the rails create openings for doors down below and a drawer above. And building a face frame's super easy. Just drill pocket holes at each end of the rails and then attach everything together with Kreg joinery. Once you put the face frame in place, the pocket holes are in the back side of the frame, so they won't even show. And you'll use pocket hole joinery again to attach the face frame to the box. It's a really easy assembly, but it adds a great effect. In this upper rail, I'm also going to drill some pocket holes along the edge for attaching it to the top. With the pocket holes all drilled, you can assemble your face frame. And here are a couple of tips to make it easier. First, I went ahead and made some alignment marks where the rails intersect the stiles. That way I don't have to measure as I'm putting each piece in place. Second, use clamps to hold the joints together. That keeps everything aligned and holds the faces of the pieces nice and flush as you drive in the screws. With that, all you have to do is drive home the pocket hole screws. Now you can pop off the clamps, and I'll flip the assembly around to do the other side. Make sure you take time to get everything lined up, but the marks make it really easy. A lot easier than trying to hold a tape measure, hold the piece in place, and close a clamp. Double check that piece. I want to move it a hair. And in just a couple of minutes, you've put together a face frame. And when you add it to the project, it transforms a big plywood box into a great looking piece of furniture. Pocket hole joinery is also used to attach the face frame to the box. And as you're attaching it, you want to look out for things like alignment issues. Here you can see that the side isn't perfectly flush with the edge of the face frame. And you can't fix that by sanding. If you try to sand that off, you'll go all the way through the face layer of the plywood and you'll leave a really ugly spot on the side of your project. So what you want to do is just pull it back into alignment. It's easy to do. And then use a clamp to hold it there. This clamp fits into the pocket hole and then snaps in place to hold that piece flush while you drive in the screws. So with the pocket hole screws installed, the face frame's in place, and I can lay the project down, give it a final sanding, and it's good to go. One of the best ways to really dress up a DIY project and add custom details is with trim and molding. It's something that's easier to do than you might think, and it really adds a lot of pop to the look. In the case of the step-back cupboard, the trim and molding starts at the base with feet. It's not actually feet though. It's just boards that wrap around the base and have an arch shape cut into them. When combined together, they create the look of feet at each corner. The pieces are bevel cut at 45 degrees, so they'll fit together nice and tight. And before we can attach this piece, we need to lay out and cut that arch shape, and it's easy to do. I'm going to clamp this piece down so that it won't go anywhere. And then you can lay out how far the arch will start from each end. I've taken a compass and set it to 1 inch, which is the height of this arch. So just use it to draw in that shape. That gets it at each end. Now, I've set the multi-mark to 1 inch. I'm going to adjust it just a little bit to match my line and use it to pull a straight line across. Now you can cut the shape using a jigsaw. If you haven't used a jigsaw a lot, it can be hard to keep the blade right on your cut line, but don't worry about it. Just saw a little bit to the waist side, and then you can come in and sand everything nice and smooth. Now, a jigsaw can put out a lot of noise, so I'm going to make sure to get set. And there you go, I've actually got a nice smooth shape there. You'll find that using the right blade makes a big difference. So I have a scrolling blade that's made for fine cuts. And with a little practice, you'll be able to get great results. Once again, you can sand to smooth it out if you need to. So with the arch cut, it's ready to drop in place to create the look of those feet. The usual way to attach trim like this is with nails, but that doesn't mean a hammer and nails. For a lot of us, it can be really hard to hold everything in place and try to drive those nails in without the piece moving around and without the inevitable misses and dents that you're going to leave. That's why for attaching trim, one specialty tool is really handy, and that's a brad nailer. It drives these nails called brads that come attached in a long clip like that. And you might not own a brad nailer, but they've gotten really inexpensive these days, or you can rent one at any home center. The nice thing with a brad nailer is it fires those nails right in there and nothing moves around. The brad nailer will leave holes, but you can easily fill those, sand it off smooth, and by the time you stain and finish, you'll never know they're there. With this piece in place, it gets topped off by a piece of cove molding. Cove is available in any home center, and you can just cut it to length. Once again, it's mitered so that it wraps around the corner and creates a finished look. So you have the pieces cut to length, just position them and drive in the nails. So you can see how easy it really was to create the look of feet. Just 3 boards and 3 lengths of cove molding. Now we'll wrap up the top with some cap molding. To wrap up the lower part of the step-back cupboard, we're using another off-the-shelf molding. This time it's called cap molding. All you have to do, once again, is cut it to length and miter the corners to fit, and then nail it on. If you end up with any slight gaps or imperfections around your molding, don't worry about it. You can use a little bit of wood filler to fill those in, sand it down, and when you stain, you'll never see them. Lots of beginning project builders, and even some experienced ones, are afraid to tackle projects with doors. But like many things, you'll find that building doors and installing them is a lot easier than you might think. You can even create a classic frame and panel style door, like we're using on the step-back cupboard, very easily. Doors are really pretty simple. They're made of a few parts. You have vertical stiles with horizontal rails in between, and that makes up the outer frame. For the panel, we're using 1/2-inch thick plywood. When it drops in place, the 1/2-inch thick panel sits below the 3/4-inch thick stiles and rails and gives that great classic look. Panel comes soon, but first you need to assemble the frame. And pocket hole joinery is the way to go here as well. All you have to do is drill pocket holes in the ends of each of the rails. Now you can assemble the frames by driving in the pocket hole screws. To switch to a driver bit, I always like to turn the clutch setting down so I don't worry about overdriving the screws. It's also a really good idea to clamp the pieces together while you're assembling them. That helps keep everything aligned and keeps the faces of those pieces nice and flush. If you ever have a time when you can't drive the screw quite far enough, just turn up your clutch setting a bit. Sometimes when you're putting pieces together, you need to kind of pull or push them into position, and that's where the clamps are really helpful, because it would be very hard to hold that and drive the screws in at the same time. You ever thought that building a door frame was hard? It's really just that easy. Now we can drill the pocket holes in the door panels. And for that, we're going to use a Kreg jig accessory called a micro pocket drill guide. You can use standard Kreg screws in the standard guide in 1/2-inch material, but 1/2-inch plywood is actually pretty thin, quite a bit under 1/2 inch. So switching to the micro pocket makes sense because it uses a smaller screw than a standard Kreg screw, and that lets you create a smaller pocket hole and drive that screw down in deep where it won't show as much from the back side. All you have to do is take the standard drill guide out of the Kreg jig and drop the micro pocket in, set for 1/2-inch material. Then install the micro drill bit, and you're ready to drill the pocket holes. Here's a good tip anytime you're building with plywood. Plywood has a good face and a less attractive face. So you always want to be sure that the good face is what's going to show. That means drill the pocket holes in the back side. Doesn't take a lot of holes to hold these panels in. Do a couple in each end. And then a few along the edges. Pocket holes are done. Before installation, I like to take a little sandpaper and just knock off the edges that are splintered on the pocket holes. Now you can install the panels in the doors, which is just a matter of driving in the pocket hole screws. But since the panels are 1/2-inch thick and the door frames are 3/4, the panel may not drop evenly into the opening, or it may push all the way down, which will take away that reveal. The reveal's in the back now, and we want it in the front. An easy way to make sure the panel's positioned properly is to use spacers. These are just pieces of 1/4-inch square dowel that I had left over from another project. Spacers can be really handy to help hold things in place and keep them consistently spaced during assembly. So let's drop them into the opening and set the panel down onto the spacers. Now I can drive in the screws. Since I have the panel sitting on the spacers and I can hold the door in place easily, I'm not going to worry about clamps. I like to kind of slowly drive in the first couple and work my way around the panel. That way, I can be sure that it's going to hold while driving in the rest of the screws. Now with those set, should be able to just drive the rest of the screws in. So I've got them all there, and you get a nice, consistent reveal and a classic frame and panel look with really simple construction. You've seen that building doors is really easy. What can be intimidating though is actually mounting the doors to your project. There are lots of kinds of hinges available and it can be tough to sort through all the choices. Plus, installing the hinges correctly really scares people because if you don't, the doors won't work or fit properly. But once again, it doesn't have to be hard if you go about it the right way. On this project, we used concealed hinges. They fit in behind the door, and what's nice is they don't show once the door is installed. Plus, they're adjustable and they work really well. They can be challenging to install though because they have to fit into a deep hole that you drill in the back of the door, and you need to position them correctly to make sure that they're straight and that the door will fit right. Thankfully, there's an option that makes it easier, once again with a jig. A concealed hinge jig guides a drill bit that will allow you to drill that hole straight and accurately to the right depth without needing a drill press or other fancy tools. It's really easy to use. It sets the right offset so that you know that the hinge will be located the correct distance in, and it has a measuring scale so you can determine how far from the end you want your hinge to be. Usually 2 to 3 inches from the end is fine. So just position the jig and clamp it down. At the same time, I'm clamping the door to the work surface so it won't move around. Then put the bit in your drill. When you lock the guide into the jig, it holds everything in place and ensures that you'll drill straight and to the right depth. So it's really easy to drill that large hole, but you also need 2 holes for the screws that'll mount the hinge. So you can drill those at the same time. Now, just pop the jig off and move to the other end of the door. Once again, going 3 inches from the end and clamping the jig to the door and the door to the work surface. Don't forget to do those hinge holes for the mounting screws. So, though it looked messy while it was being done, look at that. Perfectly clean hole for the hinge cup and properly positioned holes for the mounting screws. Now I know that the hinges will drop in just the right place, and I'll be able to mount it to the cabinet successfully. It'll fit right and work right. So with the hinges installed, I'm ready to hang my doors. Mounting the hinges onto the doors is half the job. The other half is mounting the doors onto your project. There's no jig for this, but there are some tips that'll make it easier. These hinges mount on the edge of the face frame, and the doors overhang the opening, in this case, by a ½ inch at the top and the bottom. So I'm going to take the multi-mark, set to a ½ inch, and just make a reference mark here. Doesn't even have to be perfect. I'm just going to use it to eyeball the location. So now I can hold the door in place and line it up with that ½ inch mark. There's adjustment built into the hinges, so I don't have to worry about getting it exact. Make sure it's in place, and I'll mark locations for pilot holes for the hinge mounting screws. And then I can drill the pilot holes. Now bring the door into place. Get around where I can see that hole. I like to get both screws kind of started. Get myself approximately lined up, and then drive the screws in. Raise this one just a hair. And that gets the basic installation done. You can see that the door swings just like it's supposed to, and it sits nice and straight. So with that done, you can move on and mount the second door. So when I close the doors, yep, you can see there's some difference in the height here. This one's sitting a little bit low. That's okay though, because there's adjustment built into the hinges. You just open the door and loosen the mounting screws, and then slide this one up and tighten it back down. May have to move this door down just a little bit as well. Now everything's nice and even there. The thing I love about these hinges is not only can you adjust the position of the mounting screws, but there are additional adjustments like this one that sets how far in or out the door sits, and this one that adjusts how close or far away it sits from the cabinet. So with all those adjustments, you can really fine-tune your doors and make them fit great. With the doors installed, there's just one last piece of hardware to add, and that's the decorative knobs or pulls that you're going to use. Should be easy since it's just drill a hole and mount the knob, but this part can still be intimidating because this is the hardware that shows. And if it's positioned wrong, it's going to throw off the look of your project. Now, we're going to go ahead and install it now on the unfinished cabinet. That's a great tip for building. I like to get all the hardware installed, drill the holes and everything before I stain and finish. That way I can sand out any rough spots, and then I don't have to worry about messing up my finished project. So to install the knob, you need to make sure that it's centered on the width of the stile, and then decide how far up or down you want to locate it. If you're not centering it, a good choice is to put it right in line with the lower edge of this rail. So if I had to mark all of that out by hand and try to drill that hole, that'd be tough, especially when I need to repeat it on the other side. Thankfully, once again, there's a jig. This cabinet hardware jig has a drill guide to drill a straight hole, plus it has measuring scales and a fence built in. So I've set that fence to position the hole half the distance across the stile, and I can use the measuring scale and the centering mark to line it right up with the bottom edge of the rail. Then all I have to do is clamp it in place and drill the hole. Now, it's a nice straight hole. It's positioned just where I want it. And you can see that when I install the knob, it's in just the right place. Great, but now I need to do the exact same thing over here. Once again, with the jig, it's no problem because all the measurements are set. Put the fence against the edge, set the 0 mark, and clamp it down. This is the kind of rough spot on the back of the hole here that I'm talking about that I'll sand all of it out before I apply the finish. But for now, put the mounting screw in, and spin on the knob, and you can see those are perfectly aligned and ready to go. A lot of people avoid building projects with drawers because they think that drawers are hard to build. But we're here to show you that they're really not. A drawer, after all, is just another type of box with a front and back, two sides, and a bottom. The drawer box fits into an opening in your project, and then a false front will get applied later to cover up the gaps and create a finished look. Even sizing a drawer isn't difficult. If you're using drawer slides like these, they're always a ½ inch thick. So as long as you make the total width of your drawer an inch narrower than your opening, you'll be good to go. And speaking of hardware, just because you're building DIY doesn't mean you can't have high quality hardware. These drawer slides are available in any home center, and they're not expensive. They ride on ball bearings, so the action's really smooth, and they're called full extension slides. That means they open far enough that you can get complete access to the drawer without having to reach inside. These even have a soft close mechanism, just like you'd find on a high-end kitchen cabinet. So we'll get to installing the hardware in a bit, but the first step is to build the drawer box. A lot of times, drawer boxes are built from ½ inch thick material. Using ½ inch material allows more space inside the drawer than using thicker 3/4 inch material would. So you get a little bit more space. And like other box construction, building a drawer is a straightforward process. Just cut your front, back, and sides to length, and then you can put them together using pocket hole joinery. You'll just drill pocket holes in both ends of the front and the back. To drill the pocket holes in the drawer box, we're using a Kreg jig accessory called the Micro Pocket Drill Guide. It creates a smaller pocket hole than the standard guide and uses a smaller screw that's great for seating down into ½ inch thick material. All you have to do is clamp the drawer front or back into the jig and drill the holes. So that takes care of the drawer front and back. The bottom is made from ½ inch plywood. I've gone ahead and cut that to size, so while the jig's set up, I'm going to go ahead and drill those pocket holes too. You really just need a few along each edge. So the pocket holes in the drawer box, or in the bottom of the drawer box, will go in the underside. That way they won't show from inside. And you can see too that I've drilled the pocket holes in the front and the back of the drawer instead of in the sides. And there's a reason for that. This way, with the pocket screws going this way, it adds a lot of strength. And when you pull the drawer open, you've got more strength in that joint, so you don't have to worry about your drawer box ever coming apart. Just like when you're building any kind of box, clamps are really handy, and these corner clamps hold the pieces together at 90 degrees while you drive in the screws. With the first screws in, you can pop the clamps off. Everything stays in place, and you've got access to the other pocket hole. A nice thing with building drawers this way too is with the pocket holes in the front and back of the drawer box, they won't be seen. The false front will cover the ones in the front of the drawer box, and the others will be on the back side of the drawer, so when you look inside, you won't see those. Sometimes when you pop the clamps off, things might move around just a little bit, but the other screws holding the joint together, so it's easy to just tweak the position a little bit and drive in the last screws. Now you can install the plywood drawer bottom, and it needs to sit flush with the bottom of the drawer box. If you just try to set it in place, it won't stay, and it's going to be hard to hold it there while you drive in the screws. The trick is to use spacers. Spacers can be really handy in projects. I've just cut some to length from scrap wood. The drawer sides are 3.5 inches tall, and the drawer bottom is a 1/2 inch thick, so I made my spacers 3 inches long. Just put one in each corner, and then set the drawer box, or the drawer bottom, in place in the box. Now, it's held solidly while I drive in the screws. Even though I'm using the spacers, I like to go a little bit gently and get one screw in on each side, or each edge, and that pulls things together. And then it's easy to just drive in the remaining screws. With the bottom in place, you've got a solid drawer box, and it's just made from 1/2 inch boards and a piece of plywood. When you're building a furniture style project with a face frame like this one, usually the outside edge of the face frame is flush with the outside of the box. It looks great, but it does mean there's a gap inside, and if you're installing a drawer, you won't have a surface to mount it to. You can easily get around that though by just cutting some 1x stock, putting pocket holes at each end, and screwing them inside the cabinet so that they're flush with the inside of the face frame. These just go from front to back and attach to a brace that's pocket holed in at the back. And with those, you've got a surface where you can mount your drawer slides. When you're installing drawer slides, it's a 2-step process because the drawer slide has 2 pieces. One that gets installed inside the box and another that gets mounted to the drawer. When you're trying to mount the piece inside the box, you need to try to hold it in place and keep it straight and level and drive in the screws all at the same time, and that takes more hands than any of us have. Thankfully, there's a solution, once again using a jig. A drawer slide jig is just a pair of brackets that get clamped inside the cabinet. With the jig in place, you can set your drawer slide in position, and it sits nice and level and straight and stays stable so you can concentrate on driving in the screws. Your drawer slides will come with instructions for just how far inside the cabinet it should be positioned. Usually it's around 3/16 of an inch. So once you've got it in place, using the jig, you can concentrate on just driving in the screws. With the inside portions of the slides mounted, the next step is to mount the drawer box. Let me grab it. And for the drawer to work properly, it also has to be aligned and straight. The jig, once again, makes that easy because you can pop the brackets out and flip them around, these little tabs make sure that it lines up Now you can reinstall the drawer portion of each slide. Sometimes you gotta wiggle it around a little bit to get them in place. Now, with the brackets in place on the outside, it makes aligning the drawer box easy. Just set it in place, and I'll line up the front edge with a couple of marks here on the jig. Takes just a little negotiation, but you'll get it there. And then open the slides back up. Now you can slide the drawer box out and position that portion of the slide. Just where they'll get put varies a little bit depending on the slide manufacturer. These go right at the front. Now the drawer box is held in place, and you can drive in those screws. Got to kind of locate where the back screws go. By just kind of playing with the halves of the slide. With the screws in the drawer box, you can pop the jig brackets out and close the drawer. Sometimes the slides are a little bit stiff at first, but they'll come around. Now they work great, but if you notice, even with the jig, the drawer box is a little bit low on this side. That's fine though. The mounting holes are slotted. So all you need to do is loosen one screw, adjust the position, and you can take care of that misalignment. The final piece to add to the drawer is the false front. It goes on to hide the hardware and the gaps around the drawer box. Here are a couple of simple tips to make it easier to align it. First, I like to use a spacer. I know I want a 1/2 inch between the doors and the drawer front, so I've grabbed an extra piece of my 1/2 inch material. Second, to align it from side to side, I know what I want the offset to be, so I've set my multi-mark to that, and I just align it with the spacer holding it. I can clamp it down. Then you can go ahead and attach the false front with a couple of pocket hole screws driven from the inside. And with that, this cabinet will be ready for its last piece of hardware, the drawer pull. After you've gone to the work to build a drawer and add a nice front to it, you want to make sure that you get the hardware positioned correctly. Usually that means having it centered from side to side and from top to bottom on the drawer front. Getting everything aligned and drilling the holes accurately would be very difficult by hand, especially on a pull like this one that has 2 holes. The solution, and a way to make sure you'll be successful, is to use a jig. This cabinet hardware jig will automatically position the holes and allow you to drill them nice and straight. But to do it, you've first got to get it centered on the drawer, and that's easy. Just measure the width of your drawer front, in this case, 21 inches. So I know that half of that is at 10 1/2. Now, I'll just draw a little line using the multi-mark to make sure it's square. I've already adjusted the drill guides on the jig to match the hole spacing of the pull, and I've set the fence so that the distance from the fence to the holes is half the width of the drawer front. Now, you can align the jig with the center line you drew on the drawer front using the 0 mark or the little window, and then clamp the jig down. Then you're ready to drill the holes. The guides make sure that the holes are nice and straight. Pop the jig off, and got 2 perfect holes. Now, I'm not worried about the alignment mark that's drawn on here. It's one of the reasons I always like to install hardware when the project is still raw. I'll go ahead and sand and get everything ready before applying this final stain and finish. But for now, we'll test fit the hardware. And you can see that thanks to the jig, it's going to line up and look great. The upper part of the step-back cupboard is built a lot like the lower section. In this case, it's built a lot like a bookcase, so again, a big plywood box. You can start by cutting the 2 sides and the top to size from plywood. After you have the pieces cut, you can drill pocket holes in the sides and in the top. The pocket holes will be used to attach this part together and to attach the face frame and mount it to the lower section later. After that, you can put it together using pocket hole joinery. Once again, using a couple clamps will help hold everything in alignment while you're driving in the screws. Then you can add shelf pin holes. In this case, there's 2 sets of holes because there's 2 shelves. Just position the jig, drill the holes, and then move it to the next location. The face frame comes next, so cut the parts to size from 1x2 and 1x3 boards. Drill pocket holes in the face frame parts where needed and screw it together. Then you can attach the face frame using pocket hole joinery. Give the face a good sanding to smooth everything out, and you're almost ready to complete the upper section. With the face frame on, the upper box is looking great, but you can dress it up even more with some simple trim that wraps around. It consists of a few pieces. First is a cap that's made of 3 mitered 1x3s, and then there's cove molding that goes underneath. Putting the cap together is really easy. A lot of people don't think of using pocket hole joinery with mitered corners, but it works great. You can see it's really no different than doing any other pocket hole joint. The holes are still perpendicular to the edge that you're going to join, so when you drive in the screws, it'll pull those 2 pieces tightly together. Once again, it really helps to clamp everything down. And you can drive in the screws. Don't forget when you go from drilling to driving to come back to your clutch setting so you don't overdrive. Kind of handy sometimes to have a clamp on each end of your work surface. If you have to, sometimes it'll clutch out before the screw's completely tight. Just crank a little more pressure on the clutch and drive the screw the rest of the way in. So now you've got a cap that you can place on top. When you're installing something like this cap, you want to have it overhang equally on each side. And that's another great place for the multi-mark, because you can set that distance and just gauge it on each side. If everything's even, you're ready to nail it on. Now you can complete the look with cove molding. Cove molding just comes off the shelf at the home center in long lengths, and you can miter it to fit using a miter saw. I like to put one piece in place and hold it up tight, then use the next one to align the corner. Now I know when I nail it in, I'll get a nice tight fit. Then you can just work your way around. You do end up with some small nail holes, but that's no problem. A little wood filler will take care of those. Sand it smooth and you'll never know the nails are there. And really, for just a little bit of extra effort, you can see that it's really worth it. It's taken what started as a plywood box, got a face frame to dress it up, and now really looks great by adding simple molding. The shelves for the upper section of the step-back cupboard are just like the shelf in the lower section, plywood with solid wood edging. But there is one difference. You'll see that the edging stops short of the length of the shelves, and there's a good reason. When you put the shelves in place, the edging sits flush with the face frame for a very nice look. It's a simple detail, but it adds a lot. When you're building DIY projects, one of the most satisfying parts is getting to this point, where everything's put together and you're just about ready to apply the final finish. You know, finishing is one of those places where you can really customize your project. Even if you're building from a plan, you can totally change it up depending on the stain color or the paint that you use. And applying that final finish to your project doesn't have to be as difficult or as intimidating as you might think. I've got some tips that'll help you have great success. First, you'll notice that I've taken the step-back cupboard and kind of blown it apart. You don't really need to disassemble your project, but if it has pieces that easily come apart, it's a good idea to kind of separate them, and then you don't have nearly as many nooks and crannies to reach into and try to work around. I also like to pre-fit all the hardware and then remove it before finishing. That way, if there's any marks or anything around the holes that I've drilled, I can sand those out before I go on with finishing. And once you have your hardware taken off and you're ready to go, it's time for the part nobody likes, but that's really important, and that's sanding. You know, it's not a lot of fun, but it's really important to take the time and invest in that prep work. It'll make a big difference in how your project looks. And you want to be sure to sand consistently. If you sand some parts to, say, 100 grit and others to 150 or 180, the rough parts and the smooth parts may absorb stain differently and lead to big inconsistencies in color. So it's really important to take the time. You know, you're going to live with the project for a long time, and so, you know, what's another hour or two of sanding time? And a great sanding tip that a lot of people forget about is when you have these edges on your project, just take a piece of sandpaper and just slightly go over all those edges. You're not rounding them off, you're just knocking off that sharp corner. You'll get a lot better results, it won't be a fragile corner, and the stain will stick better as it's wrapping around there. When you're done sanding, obviously you're going to vacuum or wipe down your project, and you may think it's ready to go, but there's probably a lot more sawdust left behind than you'd think. So grab a tack cloth and wipe down the surfaces. You'll get a lot more sawdust off than you might expect. You know, tack cloth is kind of gummy, or it's a tack cloth, so don't press real hard. You don't want to push that tacky material into the surface, but just get everything wiped down. Finally, when you're sanding, it gives you a great chance to look over your project one more time and make sure that you haven't missed any spots, and if you need to, add a little wood filler to fill in the gaps. Be sure that you get wood filler that's stainable so it won't interfere with your stain. With those things done, you'll be ready to apply your finish. When you're ready to stain your project, one of the hardest decisions to make can be what color to choose. There's so many stain colors available. I like to make up some samples. You know, this is one where I've taken a piece of the scrap material and applied two colors that I thought I was going to like. Well, one was way too red, didn't like that. The other one was really light. So I went back to another sample board that I'd made before, and it has a bunch of different colors on it. And I found that for this project, I really like this one. Happens to be mahogany, so that's what I'm going to use. Now, even if you're sure you found the right stain color, there's nothing worse than getting partway through and deciding that you just don't like it, because there's no turning back at that point. You can't sand through the stain most of the time. So a good idea is to start on an interior part of your project or with a small piece like these shelves, because if you make a mistake on the shelf, you can rebuild this pretty easily. But having to start over on this is not going to be any fun at all. So speaking of stain, I like to use a gel stain, and I think you'll really like them. Just like it sounds, a gel stain is thick. Kind of looks like pudding. And the big advantage of gel stains are several. First of all, because it's thick, it doesn't run and slop and get all over the place like liquid stain. Second, being thicker, it clings to surfaces. So whether you're doing a flat surface or a horizontal surface, it's not going to get all over the place. But third, and the reason that I really like gel stain, is it doesn't soak in quite as deeply to the wood. It still gives great color, but when you apply it, it's thicker. So it doesn't soak in as much, and you won't get inconsistencies in color like liquid stain can give you, because soft areas of the wood absorb more stain than the light, or soft areas of the wood absorb more stain than the harder areas. So it's really easy to apply. Just go ahead and wipe it on. I'm just using a foam brush. And by the way, don't buy the cheap foam brushes, buy good ones. They'll actually last while you're using them. And just cover an area. One thing I'm making sure is that I cover a whole panel at one time. I don't want to stop partway across and let that stain dry and then start again, or you may end up with a visible line called a lap mark where you get more stain overlapping, and it will really show. So with a gel stain, just wipe it on. You can leave some excess on the surface, and then let it sit for a minute or two. Grab a rag and just start to buff up the extra. Now, one great thing about working one panel at a time too is sometimes projects get interrupted. You know, everybody's busy, we got things going on, and you may not be able to even finish the staining in one session. So if you do one panel, even if it's the side of the cabinet, and you have to walk away for an hour or a day or a week, again, you can come back and just start staining at the next spot because you don't have to worry about that overlap. Once you have your panel done, take a look. Look for any bare spots or areas that may need more stain. If you don't see any, you're ready to move on. So eventually, you'll work your way around. It really doesn't take a long time. Because the project's been sanded well, and because I'm confident that it was ready for stain, I'm really not worried about the results I'm going to get. I know that if I use a gel stain and I apply it by the directions, which is pretty much slop it on and wipe it off, not really directions, I know I'll get good results, and I'll end up with a color that I really like. Now, of course, when you first apply stain, it will be a little bit dull, but don't worry about that. Before I talk about what comes next, I want to talk about these, your stain rags. These rags that are soaked with stain, please don't leave them wadded up. A wadded up rag will actually start having a chemical reaction, and it can get hot enough to catch fire. It happens in shops, it happens in restaurants with greasy food rags. Don't let it happen at your house. Take your stain-soaked rags, open them up flat, and then lay them out on the concrete or hang them on a line until they're good and dry. Might take a couple of days. Then you can throw them away with your regular trash. But you just need to be safe and to make sure that you don't risk anything with a simple mistake, which can be taking a rag and tossing it on the floor. So, get that one laid out. When you get your stain on, again, project's gonna start to look great, but you might be a little bit disappointed at first because you expect that really vibrant color and it's a little bit dull. That's because stain alone doesn't finish your finishing process. You also need a top coat or a clear finish over the top. And again, I like to make that process easy, so a good choice is to go for what's called a wiping varnish. You can get wipe-on polyurethane or wipe-on varnish. And like the name says, you can wipe it on with a rag or with a foam brush, and you don't rub it back off in the same way that you do stain, but you don't have to spray it with expensive spray equipment that can be hazardous. You don't have to try to brush it and get those brush marks out. It's just very forgiving, and it'll give a really nice look. So that's a lot of basics about staining, but you know, this is an area where a lot of people really get scared because great looking color can make a so-so project look fantastic, and a bad color can make a great project not look so good. So take the time, check your project over, sand it, choose the right color, choose the right stain, and you'll have great results. So with that gel stain applied and a couple of coats of wipe-on varnish, I think the step-back cupboard project looks great. I really like the color and the sheen of the finish. It does feel a little bit rough, and that's going to happen when you're finishing in your garage or maybe even outside. But all you need to do is grab some furniture paste wax and very fine steel wool and just kind of buff it out, like waxing your car. Wipe it off with a rag, and you'll get a really smooth finish. So I hope you've learned here that whether you maybe have been afraid to build DIY projects or you've built DIY projects in the past and not gotten the results you wanted, that it's really not as hard as you might think. Even a complex project or a seemingly complex project like this one isn't if you break it down. You know, we really started with pieces of plywood and built essentially big boxes. Then we used ordinary boards from the home center to add features like a face frame and even doors and a drawer. Some simple trim dresses it out and creates a project that doesn't look to many like something that you do yourself. But guess what? You did it yourself. You'll be proud to have this, and the cool thing is, if you can build this project, you can build tons of projects like it. I mean, after all, it's really just big boxes that are dressed up. So if you want to build a chest of drawers, or maybe a bathroom vanity, even a kitchen cabinet, even a whole kitchen, these are the techniques you're going to use. You know now that you don't need high-end skills. You don't need fancy woodworking tools. You need basic DIY tools, some great tool accessories, and the right tips and techniques. So if you break a project down, instead of thinking of it as complex, you'll see that it's a series of easy steps. And if you expect great results and take your time, you'll get great results when you build your own DIY projects.